And welcome to everyone joining us today. We're happy to have all of our attendees who are hailing from various parts of the globe today. It's not just in the Caribbean from what I see, and we're happy to have you all. So I'm Nichelle Grandison, and I am the MD or Chief Strategy Officer at Strategy Plus Consulting, and we are the hosts for the Caribbean Strategy Summit for 2023. The first we hosted would have been last year, which was heavily set in strategic planning. This year, our theme is going to be strategic performance management. Okay, so the entire strategy series, webinar series that is linked back to this summit, as you would have seen from our advertising. So today's topic, it's going to be on, let me just pull that up so I'm totally accurate. Practical strategy development and goal setting, communicating what matters. And it's going to be presented by the Howard Rom of the Balanced Scorecard Institute. He is the founder and the owner of the Strategy Management Group, which is the umbrella group for the Balanced Scorecard Institute. He is the author and performance management trainer and consultant, technologist, and keynote speaker with over 40 years experience in strategic planning and performance measurement and management. One key thing to note, he has developed the Institute's 9 steps to success that basically underpins the whole Balanced Scorecard strategic planning and management framework. Good. So later on, we'll chat some more on the summit, but for now, I'll hand you over to Howard. Howard, over to you.
Very good. Thank you, and welcome to everybody. Let's see if I can go to the next slide here. Just a few notes. We'll be recording this session, and we'll get you e-link, email with a link within the next day or two. There'll also be a handout of the webinar. We'll create a PDF copy of this and send it to you as well. It's best if we use the chat, not use the chat box, but use the question and answer, the Q&A box that's located at the bottom menu. If you have a question, we'll take questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll answer as many of those as we have time. So let me go ahead and get started. A couple of topics on today's agenda. One, developing practical strategy, developing practical goals, and then communicating our strategy clearly. And then Nichelle will share a few words on the upcoming Caribbean conference. I'll base this presentation today on the work we've done in about 40 countries, something approaching 400 different organizations in all sectors that we've worked with over the last 25 years or so with the Balanced Scorecard Institute and the Strategy Management Group. Here's some of the things that we have observed that make strategy not very practical, or it can be, considered poor strategy, poor practice. But the first question you ought to ask yourselves is whether you have poor strategy or whether you have good strategy with poor implementation. Because an awful lot of times we see poor implementation as the answer to the strategy. But there are some common mistakes, things that you should consider obstacles and really red flags if you see them. Sometimes planning takes too long. It's an endless process. And in today's climate of a fast pace, the strategic plan is basically out of date by the time it's finally approved. A lot of times we see an awful lot of emphasis on planning. Planning's the easy part. Strategy execution is the hard part. Another, focusing plans that have a lot of words on the activities that the organization is going to do rather than the outcomes and the results that the organization is trying to achieve. Another common mistake we've seen is the strategic plans that are basically a list of initiatives or projects. It's like defining strategy as the collection of all of the stuff that we're currently working on, which really isn't a strategic plan. We also find a lack of ownership and accountability, and a lot of times we'll set up a lot of committees, and what we're looking for here are, of course, direct owners of various things that make up a strategy, so that we have individual and collective accountability for results built into not just the strategy development, but the implementation as well. Poor goal setting is a common mistake, right? And communicating those goals below the executive level. I can't tell you the number of times I've met with executive teams who seem really clear about what the organization is doing. And you go down 2, 3, 4 levels in the organization, and those goals become very ambiguous, or not communicated at all. That's a problem we see a lot of. A lot of times we'll see a vision statement that really sounds nice, but is open to different yet plausible interpretations, with a lack of clear goals as well. So be careful when you're writing your vision statements. Poor alignment between corporate strategy and what the departments are doing and the functions that go on below the corporate umbrella. And of course, too many projects, too little prioritization. It's easy to add projects to the list. It's harder to prioritize and create an A list, a B list, and a C list based on your resource availability. So those are some of the things we're going to try and tackle and deal with, how to overcome some of those obstacles. So I guess the first question you might ask yourself is, what do I mean by practical, right? What's the difference between practical and not so practical? Here's my short list of things that I would recommend if you're doing strategic planning. Make sure you agree on the dictionary, create a common language. Unfortunately, for those of us in the strategic planning and management business, there's not common usage of words. My goal might be your objective, and your initiative might be my performance measure, and vice versa. So one of the first things you can do, and one of the most impactful, even though it's not listed a lot of times in strategic planning frameworks, is to make sure you agree on words. Second is adopt some sort of a discipline framework. Strategic planning, strategy development goes much better when there's discipline around it, rather than the free-for-all that we see many times in strategic planning sessions. So build a disciplined, use a discipline framework would be my advice. Recognize that strategy has altitude, and I'll show you what I mean by that a little later. There's a hierarchy, there's an order to things when you're dealing with strategy, and what you want to end up with is things that connect, right? You go from high altitude down to low altitude. Goals that are measurable, objectives that are actionable, and we'll talk more about that as we go on here. The point is, you want a strategy and a strategy document that tells the stories. The strategy is a story. It's about storytelling. And in the case of an organization, it should be about the value creation story. How are you going to create value for your customers, for your employees, for the community, for the environment within which you operate? So I call that connecting the dots, again, between high altitude, mission, vision, and values, and low altitude, which is the work that we do at our desk or on the shop floor. So that's my interpretation of what practical means. Words do matter. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in an organization somewhere in the world, and you walk in one office and they're talking about goals, and goals, and you walk down the hall to another office, department, another division, and they're talking about objectives and objectives and objectives. And it takes you a while to figure out that they're really talking about the same thing. So words matter a lot. And if you actually start with a dictionary and make sure you get agreement, everything will go smoother. I guarantee you that if you agree on the words up front and you use them throughout the hierarchy of the organization, you will get to a better result than if you sort of don't pay a lot of attention to that, or let everybody, worst case, define what they mean by themselves as you go farther down in the organization. I've seen that too. And what do we mean by strategy, right? We want to agree on that too. Awful lot of organizations get this wrong, and they define strategy as the sum of what they're currently working on. That's our strategy, everything that I'm doing today. We like to, use a definition that says that strategy is about storytelling. It's about a path and a plan, and it involves choices on what you're going to do, and just as important, what you're not going to do to move from point A to point B, right? And a strategy ties organization value creation through the use of resources. So that's what we mean by a strategy. There's an awful lot of different ways that you can apply discipline to this process of strategic thinking and strategic plan development. Some of the common ones that we see: Blue Ocean, Porter's 5 Forces, OKRs, strategy profiles, which identify differentiators that where you want to compete against your competitors, or if you're a government or nonprofit, where you want to excel at service delivery. The Balanced Scorecard, of course, developed by Kaplan and Norton and enhanced by us at the Balanced Scorecard Institute. Peter Drucker's original work, Management by Objectives, Ocean Conry, and many, many others. I think, I forget which university it was, did a study once on the number of different frameworks, models, techniques, and approaches to strategic planning and management, and the list was somewhere around 100. I'm probably a little embarrassed to tell you that I've worked on about 30 different ones over the course of my career, and settled on the Balanced Scorecard for about the last 25 years. And of course, there's always the traditional way you could do it. You could just identify a bunch of strategy goal buckets and take all of the things that you're currently working on and put them into the buckets. I'm embarrassed again to tell you I used to do it this way 40 years ago. This was the common way that I learned it. And of course, what you did when you ended up with programs that you wanted to continue to fund, you didn't have a bucket for it. You wouldn't cut the programs. You would just, create a new bucket, of course. So traditional looks like this. We're going to quickly write a vision and mission statement. We'll set some goals, usually 6 or 8 or 10, some big number of goals. We need a lot of buckets for all the stuff that is important to us. We'll choose projects, programs, and then we'll create some measures and targets and assign some responsibility and set the budget. Problem with that is there's usually a rush to judgment to get to the measures and get to the projects and get to the budgets, right? It appears to be simple and straightforward, but when you actually take a hard look at it, it is a very ineffective way of, number one, telling your value creation story, and number two, giving you a strong foundation to continue to go to the budget formulation process and request money for the things that are important to your organization's mission and vision. So we don't do it that way anymore. What we like to do is think about a number of different steps in a process. We'll start at high altitude with mission and vision and core values. We'll look at the various analyses, SWOT and PESTLE, that we have available to us: market analyses, environmental assessments, foresight analysis, scenario planning. We look at the results of those along with identifying who our customers are and what they need, and create something called a customer value proposition. Remember, your customers are the direct beneficiaries of your products and services, right? They're a subset of the universe of folks called stakeholders. So think of customers as direct beneficiaries and stakeholders as the universe, everybody that we are involved with in our organization. So this is a strategic thinking process then. It's a process of discovery. And out of that, we'll create 3 or 4 perspectives. We like to use 4 perspectives when we do strategic thinking. One is the financial or stewardship if you're government or nonprofit. Another is through the eyes of the customer. Process, business processes is a perspective. And then organizational capacity is the 4th perspective. I'll show you an example of how that flows out when we're done. We like to identify 3 or 4 strategic themes, not 6 or 8 or 10 goals, but actually strategic themes, and then an associated set of goals written in end state language. What have I actually accomplished if I'm successful? In other words, project yourself to a future success and write your goal with that in mind. 3 or 4 strategic themes. will work very well for an organization. I mean, we've used that logic for an organization as small as a lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. with 10 people to literally an organization worldwide with 140,000 members. So 3 or 4 themes is about what you need to essentially tell your value creation story for your organization. Once we have those themes and results, we'll move down to strategic objectives. These are the DNA of the strategy, and then create something called a strategy map, which is a very powerful way of communicating your value creation story, both internally and externally. And then from that, we'll set some strategic KPIs and strategic initiatives. And that will encompass the totality of a strategic planning process. So the logic works something like this. Strategy has altitude, and strategy exists at different altitudes within the organization. It's not just executive strategy or corporate strategy. We can have strategy at department, division, branch levels as well. But the logic at the top at corporate, where we put most of our energy, because we want to get that one right. You know, if we get the corporate strategy and corporate strategic planning right, we can then cascade it down to the rest of the organization. So we want to get that one right. So we'll start with who are our customers or stakeholders. What does the market look like? What do our customers need? We'll define our purpose. That's the mission, what we do. Our vision is a picture of a successful future. Those perspectives are different views of organizational performance, a way of making strategy conversations more manageable and more meaningful. Strategic themes and results. I mentioned 3 or 4 themes, 3 or 4 associated results. These are the pillars of excellence that your organization wants to do well at. They drive the key results, main focus areas of the business. Strategic objectives come next, and developing a strategy map, and then the performance measures and targets will set, and then strategic initiatives, projects and action plans that drive results. So, you know, as you look at the logic of strategy, you can see that the words matter, and you can also see that there's a hierarchy of how you do this and how you connect things, because the dots do connect when you go through a disciplined process of defining the components at different altitude that need to connect to tell your story. You know, over time, it's clear that the heart of a strategy, of a strategic plan, are the strategic objectives. If you get this right, everything runs smoothly. And we'll talk some more about what makes a good strategic objective in a minute, but that's a key component of any strategy exercise. The reason, though, they're so important, the reason that we call them the DNA of strategy, is because a lot of the language at high altitude, vision and mission, you know, is very vague, right? It's, I want to be a world-class performer. I want to be the provider of choice. I want to be a high performance organization. People tend to write lofty language for vision. Mission gets a little more specific usually. But the problem is, you know, it really doesn't provide an actionable focus for those of us who work on the ground floor, not on the 7th floor, right? It makes sense to the executives on the 7th floor, but it sure won't make sense to me on the shop floor to read words like, we want to become a world-class provider of energy. You know, what does that mean to me? What am I going to do today that's going to make a contribution to something called world-class performance? At the other end, at low altitude, you know, we tend to talk in terms of a service language, right? My programs, my projects, right? Training staff, building a new system, implementing the new food pyramid program in the Obama administration, right? These are low altitude things. They're very project specific. They have start and start and end dates. And so they tend to be very narrowly defined and very operational and tactical. So that's not as helpful to have a conversation about what we're trying to accomplish and what we want to be at point B in our future. So here we introduce strategic objectives as a bridge between high altitude and low altitude. So strategic objective language becomes actionable. How am I going to translate strategy into action? I want to improve something. I want to increase something. I want to reduce something. I want to strengthen something. So strategic objectives are going to start with action verbs. And again, this is a very powerful way of having conversations around, well, what does strategy really mean? How do we turn it into the language of the desktop or the language of the shop floor? Because that's where the strategy is going to be implemented. Not by those of us who are up here on the 7th floor writing it. It's all the rest of those folks who are going to have to be responsible for implementation. Some keys to good strategy are through the strategic objectives. These are action statements. They're very simple statements. We'll have a description behind them, a couple of paragraphs to describe, what's inside the fence and what's outside the fence of that particular strategic objectives. But they're easy to understand. I'm not going to need a manual. I'm not going to need a supervisor for me to understand, what it is that I'm being asked to be actionable about, right? We want to make it simple. We also want to imply continuous improvement, no start or stop activities. Strategic objectives have a continuous improvement element to them, which is why we start with an action verb. So here's some examples of strategic objectives that we've helped create in different organizations. Notice they all have an action verb in front of them, and they all deal with, revenues or customer satisfaction, costs, emissions. If you're a government agency, waste, fraud, and abuse is an important component of your work. Access, cycle time, and so on. The kinds of things that you use to run a business enterprise. So here's some not so good examples. Train all employees, create a marketing plan, and develop some strategic KPIs. Why are those not so good examples? In the Q&A, can somebody type in some possible answers? Why do you think these are not very good? What makes them not good examples?
I'm seeing Cheryl Shaw says they have an end, and Janet Brown their weasel words.
Yeah, weasel words, right? They have an end, don't they? You can imagine that I'm going to train all employees at some point, and so that's a start and a stop. So it's really a project, isn't it? That's an initiative. How about creating the market plan? Same thing. It's going to be done sometime. So it's not very strategic, number one, because it doesn't have a component of continuous improvement. Same with developing KPIs. So some better examples might be like this, right? What I really want to do is not train all employees. That's the how, why am I doing that? Ask yourself the why question. That's a good rule of thumb, by the way, folks. Anytime you have a strategic objective, really ask yourself if it answers a why question, right? So what I really want to do is improve employee skills and knowledge. And how am I going to do it? Is through training. But training isn't the only way I could improve the collective employee skill and knowledge. I could hire from the outside, couldn't I, to improve my knowledge, skills, and knowledge. So when you get to an objective, there's always more than one way, to actually do it, right? But what you're trying to capture here is the higher order, the strategic order of things. Same with creating the market plan. I really want to increase the market share of my business, and creating a market plan, is just one way of doing that. I could buy another company in the same line of work. That's another way of increasing market and share. So you get the idea. Objectives give us license to ask questions. How can we strengthen brand awareness? How can we enhance product quality? And there's always more than one way to do that. Improving strategic results rather than developing KPIs. I'm not developing KPIs is not the end game, right? Why am I doing that? What's the answer to the why question? Because I want to have better results for my organization. You get the idea. Thank you. Another way of getting practical is to put together a one-page summary of your strategy. And we use this graphic a lot. We call it a one-page balanced strategic plan. And it really does show how the logic goes from high altitude to low altitude, and frankly, how the dots connect. So in the first case, we have the high altitude vision and mission, the strategic themes and strategic results. This develops strategic context, right? It communicates what we're trying to accomplish at a high level, it defines what we mean by a vision called a world revolutionizing provider of energy products. What does that mean? It means international growth, it means operational excellence, it means energy leadership. That's how we're going to get to that preeminent position. The second part of this is the strategic objectives and the strategy map. This uses if-then logic to show a value creation process, actually visualize the strategy of the organization. And of course, each of these would be unique to the organization, even though there's some common generic words that we would start out with for objectives, for example. We always try and customize those for the language of the individual organization to be consistent with language use. Measure strategic progress. These are the measures and some targets for the coming reporting period. The measures are tied to the objectives, the targets are tied to the measures, so that we have a complete story of not just what's the strategy, but how are we going to know success when we see it or don't see it. Initiatives then are a set of high value prioritized projects that are organization wide, have a wide impact, and could be broken down into tasks and activities and individual projects as folks within the organization get tasked to provide support to those initiatives. These could either be new or they could be existing. By way of example, we did some work at the Susan Komen Foundation in Dallas, Texas. And when we arrived, they had 434 projects competing for funding for cancer research. And it turns out it's very hard to say no to a university researcher who says, I think I might have a cure. And so prioritization, which is our step 6 in our framework, was a real key important output from that process of building a balanced strategic plan. So that's the strategy side of it. Find a way to tell your story, make sure it's simple, make sure the dots connect, make sure that it can be communicated without having a supervisor or without having something to read, a manual to read to explain things. On goal setting, do you have, the question is, do you have defensible, realistic goals or what I call unrealistic hopes? Some common mistakes that we've observed in our travels, it's unrealistic aspirations. I want a 20% increase of last year's revenue. Okay, how are we going to do that? Is that realistic or is that just sort of pie in the sky? Goals that aren't communicated very well or are communicated well from floor 7 to floor 6 in the organization where the executives and the managers reside, but not very well understood by the rest of us on the shop floor or at our desktops. Little buy-in, goals created by a group that goes off to a golf resort on a weekend and writes a strategic plan and comes back Monday morning with the document held high and says, Eureka, we did it. A recipe for failure, frankly, in today's climate. Transparency and building employee buy-in right from day one in this process is what we have found to be very successful. Getting the different voices of the organization lined up to help build the strategy and the strategy management system makes a huge difference. Along with language, getting those voices in early are 2 of the most important things you can possibly do in creating better strategy and better employee involvement in the strategy process. A lot of times we won't see goal integration across the business units. The goals come out of a corporate entity, and then when you go down to the 1st and 2nd and 3rd floors in the building, you find goals that aren't connected. They don't relate to what you were given up at floor 7 and floor 6. So there's very little coordination across the business units with corporate. And I mentioned words matter. If my goal is your objective, we're already off to a bad start with communicating strategy effectively throughout the organization. So what can we do about it? Well, for one thing, if the goals are really ambiguous or not communicated very well, it really demonstrates to us an absence of strategic leadership by top management who hasn't paid enough attention to ensuring that people understand the goals and have bought into the goals, right? So we like to test goals. A filter we use is called SMART. Anybody who's been involved in strategic planning for a while knows about SMART goals. You can apply the same thing to objectives, SMART objectives: specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound is what the acronym stands for. Stay away from goals that are that have nice words, weasel words, that somebody called them in the question and answer screen. Sound good, but they're open to different interpretations, and confusion, not focus, is the unhappy consequence of unclear goals. Frequent cause of strategy execution failure. So I think of goal setting as providing service to four basic functions: guidance, direction, facilitation of the planning process, motivation and inspiration, and evaluating and controlling performance. And we think of five major categories when we do goal setting. One is on the strategic side, right? This deals with organization-wide desired results and accomplishments, employee goals, satisfaction, employee growth, contribution to the business, operational efficiency, quality, timeliness, so on. Social goals: equity, societal, environmental, sustainability. More and more organizations are building those into their strategy and communicating clearly how they contribute to society. And project goals: deliverables, resources, schedules, scope, and risk are the common measures that we use in project goals. So I'll use an example. I like to use the example of keeping the trains running on time. So strategic goals would be the right equipment, the right trains going to the right locations, satisfy customers, and build the business. Employee goals: satisfied employees with skills and abilities, knowledge, in the right position, and having a bench strength to back folks up is another employee goal. Operational goals: want to control costs. I want high utilization of my equipment. I want a good safety record. I want trains to run on time. Society: equity, community involvement. The environmental footprint of my trains is going to be an important characteristic of my social consciousness. And project goals: I want to know about purchases and maintenance schedules and resources, refurbishing stations, software, the other projects that make up keeping the trains running on time. So once again, I'm trying to think high altitude to low altitude. If I set some categories at high altitude, what does it actually mean for the organization that I am working with? How do I translate the lofty language into what it means specifically for that business? Here's another example from a baseball team, professional baseball team. The strategy is to grow the franchise and win, essentially build enthusiastic fans and make it sustainable. So we might set ourselves a goal of year over year postseason success. One of the themes might be to build a talent pool from within the organization, with strong farm system with excess supply of talented pitchers, right? Some enterprise-wide initiatives. I'm going to have to restructure my farm system to rebuild it. And some projects and tactics that might be part of that would be to decentralize the support staff and functions that make up the farm system. So once again, I'm trying to create a logic from the high altitude to the specific things that folks do on a day-to-day basis. I'll close with some quick thoughts on communicating with clarity. Or when you ask the question, or are we communicating with uncertainty? We're not communicating very well at all. An awful lot of times, it's clear to the seventh floor, but boy, I'm down here in the on the shop floor, and I just don't get it. So it means it hasn't been communicated well through the different levels of the organization. Doing an executive presentation isn't clear communications. One-way communications is not the best. When I was working at Susan Komen, for example, a new CEO came in, and the first thing that she did was have brown bag lunches in groups of 5 to 10, with over 400 employees. That's clear communications. Here's what we're trying to accomplish at Susan Komen under my watch. What's going on in your part of the organization that I need to know about. Dialogue, two-way dialogue, that's clear communications. So a town hall meeting doesn't do it either, does it? It's a start, but it's certainly not the end game. When you're putting on your hat for communicating, don't think about a single event or group events. Think about a campaign over time. Campaign thinking is what characterizes good communications. And remember that the language at the executive suite is not going to be the language of the shop floor, right? So you want another reason to get the different voices of the organization involved in your planning process, not just the strategic planning 7th floor, is to make sure that the folks get the message in the language that they understand it. So when they go back to their peers, they translate it into the language of the shop floor. We know every organization is different, but there are some things that we have observed. Explicit ownership, right, is important. Consistency of messaging is important. Make communication a regular process, not one-off events. Involve all employees to translate the messages into local relevance. It's not just for managers and executives. And never forget that I will internalize what's important to me. The what's in it for me matters a lot. And what we found in organizations when we do communications planning is the light bulb goes on for different people at different times. But when it does, when an employee sees something of value for the company, for the organization, and something of value to them from going through a process like this, strategic planning, balanced scorecard, strategic management system, then they become they take ownership, and they also become excited about what they're working on. And I love the cartoon. Well, what if, right? And I know this sounds kooky. What if we communicated with all our employees? Love it. Here's an example. We like something called a communication matrix. When you think of the different voices that you have to communicate in, we have different target audiences. We'll look at what's the desired behavior that we want out of that group. Where are we going to get resistance, right? What pain or whiffum are we going to solve with our messaging we need to solve? What are the messages? What's the medium, the media, and in whose voice? And also the timing, right? Media, timing, messenger, and message. So for each one of these different voices, target audiences, we will create a set of bullets that represent, what's the message, who's the messenger, what's the media, and what's the timing. We use a 9-step framework to do this. I mentioned there's a lot of different ways of doing this. We like this one. It's 6 steps to build a balanced strategic plan, and then roll that out to the organization. And the 3 steps, last 3 steps, deal with alignment and strategy, execution, performance analysis, and reporting, and so on. We're just in the process of completing a 4-day certification course on strategy execution. This will be a new offering for us. We've been working on it for a number of years, and it'll be released this fall. We've started teaching it in limited markets now. But essentially what we're going to do is look at the easy part is strategic planning, as I mentioned. The hard part is successful strategy execution. So we're going to look at 5 different strategy execution imperatives, and then look at challenges that we've observed in organizations around the world, and then identify some tools, some techniques, some interventions that you can use to create a roadmap, a personal roadmap for your organization, a strategy execution roadmap to help overcome some of those obstacles and challenges that you face in implementing strategy successfully. So that's coming out soon. So is a professional strategy management professional certification course. That will be a 3-day course dealing with learning how to do strategic project management for folks who know how to do project management. And Michelle, I think I will turn this over to you. And,
Sure. Thank you so very much for that, Howard. But we do have some questions
Right.
For you to field. And let me just pull up.
Stop sharing.
You can. So, quick one from Ayele. She said, communication what matters, but in the eyes of whom? How do we balance between corporate strategy, business strategy, and functional strategy in terms of communicating what matters, because everyone matters?
I think one of the keys is when you, if you use the strategic objectives, like I've talked about them, it's a very powerful way of literally cascading the strategy down to the lower altitude in the organization, going from corporate to departments, divisions, branches, however you're organized, and create strategic objectives at what we would call tier 2, which would be the business and support units that make up the organization. And then down to individual performance plans at tier 3, which would be individuals and teams of individuals who have the same job. So by sticking with strategy, we found that to work much better than the way a lot of folks have done it. When we go into an organization, they'll cascade performance measures or they'll cascade projects. But if you stick with strategy, if you stick with those strategic objectives, that's the common thread that will really really carry the day that we found. That's the best way I found of doing it in a lot of years of doing this. And then make those strategic objectives, at tier 1 and tier 2 into personal objectives at tier 3. So when I look at a position description, for example, at tier 3 for an individual employee, I'll look through those 15 or 20 bullets that typically show up under a position description and find 1 or 2 or 3 maybe that are strategically significant for the department within which that employee works. So now I've got line of sight between 1 or 2 or 3 personal objectives for Howard Rome working on the shop floor, all the way up to 30,000 feet high altitude for the mission, vision, and the core values.
Okay, good stuff. Cecilia is asking on the initiative versus project subject, how to ensure alignment of specific projects to one initiative. Should we be setting metrics for following up on initiatives, or is project tracking enough?
Well, project tracking has 4 important measures according to the Project Management Institute, right? It's risk, it's scope creep, it's schedule adherence, and it's resource adherence. So that becomes, part of your project tracking system. And when you're starting with a strategic initiative, say a corporate ERP system, enterprise resource planning system, that's going to translate into a number of lower level projects and activities and tasks all the way down through the organization. So, what I would always recommend is that you set the high level schedule, right, and then cascade down from that. It's always easier to go from high level, blessed material, if you will, down to what it means to the rest of us in the organization. As another point on this, we have ended up building scorecard systems for companies at the tier 2 level, right? And then what you have to do, you're still going to cascade down from tier 2, but you want to make sure that you're hooking into whatever you can find at tier 1 at the corporate level, so that you don't create a whole new enterprise and then leave and the organization's got to fight the battle of why did you take on this separate role and create this this sort of brand new organization. We've done that several times with the major universities where the strong departments wanted to create their own balanced scorecard system, for example. And I always make sure that we start with whatever we can find, whether it's a balanced scorecard or not, at tier 1 at the enterprise-wide level, so that we have hooks at tier 2 and so on, and then of course cascade down to tier 3.
Okay, good stuff. We have one from Gabrielle. If a strategic plan being implemented was not properly created. Example, a performance framework was not embedded in it. How would you evaluate objectively its implementation status after the strategic period?
One thing you could do is we have a spreadsheet, a matrix table that we use all the time in our consulting, and it's in our course as well. It's an inventory of the components that make up a strategic management system. So we always do is to start, because every organization is unique, and you can't just go in with a set of things that you're going to do, is take that inventory and see where what they have is good enough. We're really practical folks. We believe strongly in that, not the academic solution to something, but the practical solution to something. So whenever we go in, we'll do this inventory and we'll look for, what's good enough, right? Remember, best is the enemy of good, right? Kind of a mindset. And so we'll identify what's good enough, where are their holes, where they're missing pieces, and then we'll build out those holes. So, when you start with a strategic plan, the first thing I do is score yourself. As a matter of fact, we have a new strategy execution assessment tool. And Candace, maybe you could put the link of that in the somewhere in this Zoom call, so folks could do a self-assessment of their organization and see where they stand on strategy execution. It uses those 5 imperatives that we have built into the new course, but it gives you a Likert scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 in terms of evaluating, where you stand. So find some disciplined way of keeping score, right? Make the score as your baseline. Take an inventory of the components you have or don't have. Judge whether they're good enough to move forward. If you happen to have our book, one of the appendixes is something called Characteristics of Good. I hesitated to call them best practices because I haven't seen all the practices, but we've seen enough organizations and enough goodness, if you will, in strategy and strategic planning that we've been able to list a set of, sort of do it this way based on what we've learned for good characteristics. And then you'll get something to compare where you are against good, a scale of good, and then figure out what's left. What do I have to work on to fix to make better? My last bit of advice on that would be make sure if you don't have a whole cloth, if you don't have something to start with, go right to the strategic objectives and get those right. If you have a good set of objectives, you can always go back up and you can always go down. So that's where I would put my focus. Put your money on good strategic objectives, and you'll be able to go up, and you'll be able to cascade.
All right. There's one from Freddie. Please provide a difference between strategic theme and strategic objective.
Strategic theme is just a higher collection of strategic objectives. If I group strategic objectives, I could group them into thematic focus areas. So we'll start with a theme, and then we'll put all of the things that go on in the organization in that theme. And then we'll look them over and say, this theme encompasses strategic objectives like this. We'll make them generic to start with. Then we'll translate those into the language of the business on the next pass. So think of when we actually do this in a workshop setting, we will divide, let's say you had 4 strategic themes and 4 strategic results. We would set up 4 different workshop groups with different leaders and different members. And then we would have those meetings separately, for each one of the themes. And they would create a set of strategic objectives, usually 10 to 12, maybe 14 within each theme. Then we would take all the objectives and bring them together and facilitate them into the next highest level, get the 30 or 40 down to a dozen, maybe 14, that become the corporate strategic objectives. And then we use the corporate strategic objectives in the corporate map to go down, to decentralize, to cascade to the rest of the organization. So we're sort of building up from the knowledge of the people who are in the workshops. We're building up from the bottom, if you will, and then we're cascading, we're aggregating, and then we're cascading down from the top after getting management blessing on the high level strategic objectives.
Okay. Right. So this one was from Miguel. He said, even today, there are directors or owners of companies who see the strategy as just educational and base their decisions on experience and say that it was never necessary to take methods to run the company. How to approach those paradigms?
I would, when I talk to executives about, why do this, right? Why is it worth it? I always look at two sides of the coin. The first thing I'm interested in knowing and asking about, is what are the pains in this organization? What keeps you up at night? What wakes you up in the middle of the night, right? And then the flip side of that is, what are the benefits of going through a process like this? So I always start with questions rather than statements. What's wrong in this organization, right? And then some of the benefits. Here's some of the benefits. What benefits are you looking for if you were to take a journey like this, a strategic journey? So if you can alleviate pain or capture benefits that are important to an executive, this is an easy sell. Why should we build a balanced scorecard system? Why should we do strategic planning? Why should we worry about strategy, execution, process improvement, and so on? I mean, those are relatively easy sells if you turn it not from the language of me as a consultant or a practitioner, but if you convert the benefit language and the pain language into their words, it's not that hard to convince folks to take this journey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we'll take one last one before we chat about the summit briefly. Is there a framework or technique that you can recommend for systematically evaluating corporate strategy? This one is from Andrea.
You broke up just a little bit there, Michelle. Is there a technique or a
this
framework?
One is from Andrea, and she's asking, is there a framework or technique that you could recommend for systematically evaluating corporate strategy?
Well, I guess it's the one we just created. It's called, strategy execution assessment, and the corresponding matrix of strategy components, strategy management components. There are about 20 items that actually make up 20 components that make up a strategic management system. I think, Candace, what we'll do is put that example chart that we use a lot in the, send it out with email. I'll go ahead and do that. Put it in with the email that goes back to everybody so they can use that technique, that comparison to best practices as a way of evaluating the current state of their strategy.
Okay. All right, guys, so that's what we have time for. Thank you so very much, Howard, for these practical tips on goal setting. And now we can see a little bit clearer what we need to communicate in our strategic planning is critical. And that's why this particular topic was linked back to the entire summit that is based on strategic performance management. At the end of the day, what are we measuring? How are we measuring it? How are we communicating it is really, really critical. So thank you for that. And guys, I know there are a lot of other questions. We'll record it. If we can reach out to you individually, we will via email. If not, look out for our second installment and third. I think we have 3 scheduled thus far over the next couple of weeks leading up to the Caribbean Summit. So I'll just go ahead and share screen there briefly. Yeah, and run through quickly, because I know some of you are probably on your lunch hours, right? See if I can maximize screen. Great. Okay, so we chatted already somewhat on the theme, which is creating an agile Caribbean through strategic performance management architecture. That's our theme this year. In terms of just the summit overview, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but in the end, Our aim is really to increase the competence in strategic planning, execution, and performance management for our Caribbean leaders. And I mean, of course, if international ones would like to join and benefit, you know, and take a little vacay while you're at it and come on over to the Caribbean, we're very open. So our story, or setup, I should say, we have the symposium on the 22nd of June, and then on the 23rd, we have the strategic performance management course, which is called the KPI Essentials. And basically what that course is going to cover more or less is just to inspire leaders and senior managers even to kind of graduate from that reactive survival mode type of setting by giving them the insights and the tools to create a revolutionary strategic performance management system, which can help transform their respective organizations. So these attendees, if you come to either the symposium or conference or even the course, you can use some of what you pick up, some of these tools in the 2023 to 2024 planning cycles. And I did see questions in the Q&A surrounding some of these items. So what you will be leaving with is a customizable strategic performance management model. This is BSI's Measure, Perform, Review, Adapt. It's called the MPRA or MPRA framework, and it's a disciplined, practical, and tested approach for developing and implementing a strategic, game-changing, but sustainable KPI system. And this is for this year and beyond. That's the thing about Balanced Scorecard and their programs. And this is why I subscribed it and I promote it, because it really, really gives you this linear, logical process for all of those salient pieces in your strategic planning and performance management. Yeah. The speakers and panelists that will be on board, some are consultants, authors, trainers, practitioners in strategic planning, and talent managers. So we're inviting you to come on board. Major partners, of course, is the SMG and the BSI team, and then the Caribbean Strategy Association, as well as Strategy Plus. And collaborators in the region here is the Chamber of Commerce for Trinidad and Tobago. We have the Manufacturing Association, and then the Arthur Lock Jack Global School of Business, or the University of the West Indies. And we mentioned earlier what the 2 dates were in June. That's about 6 weeks away. There are 2 events making up the summit, all-day events, and this is your in-person versus online fees. So you can take a note of it, or you can always scoot over to our website if you missed anything. For the international persons or regional persons not located here in Trinidad, you can certainly come online for both events, right? This is why we're hosting it as a hybrid to give persons the opportunity to attend. I'm your host, of course. And these are our key strategy experts from the Balanced Scorecard Institute. This is the team, and our featured speakers would be Howard, of course, David, and Joe. I believe Joe will be kicking off with the keynote. Yeah. So join us at the Red Strat table. This Red Strat table now will feature regional leaders across the Caribbean who will come on board and tell their story. We have 3 panels that would run in between the key expert lectures from Balanced Scorecard Institute. And these are some of the confirmed speakers thus far. We have from the education sector, we have from the chambers, we have from retail, education, and manufacturing as well, I believe. Okay. So we're supposed to have at least 3 panels, 9 to 12 regional panelists. These are the industries as we mentioned before. It's going to run about for an hour per panel. There'll be ample opportunity to have Q&A, both for the lectures and for the panel discussions, right? Where they would share what they have learned and what are some enablers and challenges that they would have come across in their tenure. Quickly, this is our agenda. Again, time would not permit me to run through all of it, but you can scoot on and check that out on our website, strategyplusconsulting.org, and you should be able to get some of these topics. Our BSI feature addresses are remote work revolution, That's our keynote: overcoming strategy execution obstacles, leadership location drop, and how dashboards transform strategic performance management and leadership. And those are the 3 key ones from our international experts. And then our panels, of course, will discuss how our regional leaders have dealt with strategy, methodology, performance measurement, the hybrid workforce, all the hot topics, strategic objective setting, and culture, of course, which would underpin all of that, and how you manage all of that through effective change management. Okay, a little bit on the KPIE program. Again, we touched on using the EMPRA model, but if you like, you can get a little bit more on the overview and about of the website, either Strategy Plus or even the Balanced Scorecard Institute website. You'd find some more on this program. Yeah. These are some of the learning objectives, the benefits, and the who should attend. Yeah. So ultimately, we want to enable you to be able to contribute to the organizational success, whichever organization you are, by being able to measure what matters, as Howard touched on, what matters and what matters most, and applying what you learn in your own organization and your own organization's management architecture. All right, so we'll close on a quote. The only real difference between one organization and the other is performance of your people. Yeah. So if you have any questions, queries, or concerns, this is the contact information, or you can reach out to BSI, either or. We're always happy to share. Thank you again so much. We were happy to have you, Howard and myself. Thank you again, Howard, for taking time out from your very busy schedule. Trust me, guys, these are very rare opportunities, and we grab it when we can to have Howard chat with us, and we're very grateful. Looking forward to the second and third installment, as we said, and we'll see you guys around. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.